afternoon, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us for today's Lunch and Learn session on strategies for approaching ethical dilemmas and decision-making in nursing with Nicole Fielding and Zoë Hountalas. My name is Shauna Spicer. I'm the Alumni Relations and Annual Fund Officer at the Lawrence S. Bloomberg Faculty of Nursing. I'd like to thank Laerdal Medical Canada for supporting this event. Their investment in continuous professional development for our nursing community is much appreciated. Before we get started, I wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. I'm now going to cover a few housekeeping items for today's event. Since there are so many of us, we ask that you stay muted throughout Nicole and Zoe's presentation. There will be a Q&A period at the end of the presentation, and you can enter your questions in the chat box, or you can raise your hand and unmute yourself to ask a question. The session will also be recorded so we can share it with those that were not able to join us today. We will send you an email after the session, which will include the link to the recording as well as a survey opportunity for you to provide feedback on today's event. Now it is my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. Nicole defends professionals at regulated colleges and tribunals. She has a broad experience in health law and litigation. She assists a broad range of regulated professionals in responding to complaints, investigations, and disciplinary matters. She also works with clients on licensing and registration matters. Nicole also has experience in employment law. Prior to joining Koziebrocki Law, Nicole worked at a prominent litigation boutique in Toronto where she represented clients on a variety of civil matters. In 2018, she was awarded the Best Examination in Chief Award by the Ontario Trial Lawyers Association during its yearly provincial Moot Cup competition. Nicole is a graduate of Windsor Law School and the University of Toronto. Zoë defends regulated professionals facing complaints, investigations, and disciplinary matters. Zoë assists with college licensing and registration matters and regularly assists professionals with delisting issues with insurers. She represents health professionals before the Health Professions Appeal and Review Board, as well as various other levels of courts and tribunals. Zoë also has experience in the areas of employment law, human rights, and privacy law. Prior to joining Koziebrocki Law, Zoë worked at a leading Bay Street firm. She is a graduate of Queen's University Law School and the University of Toronto. Zoë also has a diploma in French immersion studies and is proficient in French. Thank you so much for joining us today, Nicole and Zoë. I'm going to pass it to you now.
Thank you so much, Shauna. I know I speak for myself and Nicole when I say we're very happy to be here today. We have so much respect and appreciation for the nursing profession. We know there have been significant demands on nursing professionals in the current climate with the pandemic. And we're coming here today from our legal lens to talk about strategies for approaching ethical dilemmas and decision-making in nursing. And Nicole and I work extensively with nurses with respect to regulatory matters. So this includes complaints, investigations, and in more serious cases, discipline proceedings. So we would like to share some takeaways, strategies, and things that nurses can apply in their day-to-day practice to avoid regulatory proceedings or complaints. And we're here to share those with you here today. So as Shauna mentioned, I'm Zoë and Nicole's here with me. Again, we both work frequently with nurses and have seen a number of different circumstances arise and are here to kind of share our thoughts and on how we can help nursing professionals improve their practice, identify potential issues, and deal with them when they arise. So here's our agenda for today. First, I'm going to talk about the College of Nurses of Ontario, the CNO more generally, and their public protection mandate. Nicole's then going to talk about complaints, reports, and investigations, and what to be expected, and give a bird's eye view of the process and what kind of outcomes can arise from these types of proceedings. We're then going to jump into some case scenarios and talk about issues that can arise in a workplace and certain patterns of conduct that we've noted in terms of the cases we've dealt with, and how to deal with them, how to identify them moving forward for your own practices. We're then going to talk about some strategies and takeaways from these scenarios. And of course, then we'll have our Q&A. And so keep your questions in mind for us. We're happy to answer them at the end of our presentation. So the College of Nurses of Ontario, I know you're all familiar with, they're a very important body in terms of the nursing profession. So, a unique feature about nursing is that it's a self-regulated profession. In Ontario, most health-regulated professions are self-regulating. This means nurses regulate themselves as a profession. The CNO is the governing body of the nursing profession. From the CNO perspective, membership is a privilege, it's not a right. And the college's approach is just because you have the education to be a nurse doesn't mean that you are licensed to be a nurse in Ontario. You need to meet certain requirements, as well as maintain certain conduct and make sure that you're maintaining the practice standards as set out by the CNO. So the CNO wears many different hats. It establishes requirements for entry to practice. So again, this is with respect to registration to become a nursing professional, as well as ongoing practice requirements and continuing education. They set practice standards, and this includes policies and guidelines with respect to the conduct that nursing professionals must maintain throughout their practice. They administer quality assurance, and they enforce standards of practice and conduct, which is going to be our focus here today. So the CNO has a couple guiding principles that are important to keep in mind throughout our discussions today about conduct and potential complaints that could arise. The College of Nurses really focus on public protection. Their role is to protect patients in Ontario and maintain the standards of the profession to make sure that the public is protected. So when they approach any sort of complaint or investigation, the CNO is thinking, is there a risk to the public? Is there a risk to patients? If so, how can that be mitigated or eliminated? And how can the conduct that's creating that risk be, remediated to an extent possible? The second really important principle of the CNO is transparency. So the CNO always thinks of how are we going to be transparent with the public? So for instance, if there's a referral of allegations to the discipline committee, which is more serious conduct, that will be put on the public registry so that patients in Ontario can be aware of, potential misconduct that is of concern. And again, the idea behind this is to be transparent so that members of the public can make informed decisions about their own health care. And finally, I think this goes without saying, but patient safety obviously is paramount importance. So today's focus will be enforcing the college's role in enforcing standards of practice and conduct. That's very much where Nicole and I come in as lawyers for nurses. In other words, today we're going to look at what could lead me as a nursing professional to receive a complaint or report from the college in my day-to-day practice, and what tools and strategies can I use to avoid this. So Nicole now is going to talk a little bit about complaints, reports, investigations.
Thanks, Zoe. So thanks for having us today, everyone. We're really happy to be able to speak with you today about this. And I think it's really important to have an understanding of how this process works so that you can have the knowledge that you need as you're governing your practice going forward. So Zoe discussed with you today, by virtue of being a regulated health professional and a nurse, you are subject to the governance and regulation of the CNO. The CNO ultimately gets to decide who is licensed and how that practice is regulated. So one of the ways the CNO promotes its mandate to protect the public is through reviewing and investigating complaints and reports made by members of the public, employers, and self-reports as they relate to the conduct of a licensed nurse. And they decide what action, if any, is necessary to address any concerns and promote their mandate of protecting the public. And so we've put together a very general chart here that shows you just some of the steps and actions that the college may take in reviewing information that comes before them. Okay? So as I mentioned, there's a few ways an inquiry or investigation by the CNO can be initiated. So one of the ways you'll see in the top, to me it's the left corner, is through a complaint by a member of the public. And so members of the public are able to submit complaints online through an online web form. It's pretty easy for them to go on there, put in their concerns and submit that off to the college. And the college will take the time to look at all those reports that are made by members of the public. Another way that the college might become aware of concerns is through an employer mandatory report. And so employers have a mandatory obligation to report certain conduct of nurses or certain concerns. And generally speaking, an employer is required to make a report about a nurse that they believe poses a serious risk of harm to patients. More specifically, employers will be required to make a report to the CNO in cases where there's suspected sexual abuse by a nurse to a patient, where a nurse is terminated for reasons of professional misconduct, incompetence, or incapacity, or where a nurse resigns in lieu of being terminated. And third, where an employer revokes, suspends, or restricts a nurse's privileges within their organization. And finally, the CNO might initiate an inquiry or investigation where they have reasonable or probable grounds to suspect professional misconduct. And this can come from their own information that they've been provided through another source. And this can also lead to further action against a member. So once this information has been brought to the CNO's attention, there are then a number of different steps that the CNO can take. So with respect to a complaint from a member of the public, the CNO may refer this complaint to a process called Alternative Dispute Resolution, or as we like to call it, ADR for short. And essentially what this is an alternative way of addressing a complaint to come to some kind of a resolution that both parties can accept. And so typically when an ADR process is initiated by the College of Nurses, something called a resolution agreement will be drafted. And if all parties are willing to participate in the ADR process and come to an agreement on the resolution agreement, this will be signed by the member and the complainant. And there may be a requirement for a member to complete some reflective exercises or review some of the standards from the college. And if the process is successful, typically there will be no further action taken. And this process is entirely confidential. So that's one way that the college can address a complaint from a member of the public. With respect to a report from an employer or a self-report, the CNO might provide a member with an opportunity to deliver something called a reflective letter or a written reflection on the subject matter of the report. So the CNO will ask the nurse, okay, please provide your input on this report that we've received and the concerns that have been raised. And they will typically require the member to then attend a meeting with the registrar or a representative from the college to discuss the member's reflections on the report and the concerns that were raised. Typically, if the CNO is satisfied after that meeting and after receiving the written reflection from the nurse that the member has reflected and has addressed the concerns raised in the report, the CNO may deem the process complete at that stage and no further action will be taken. If the CNO continues to have concerns, then they may initiate a further investigation process. And so that kind of takes me to the third general type of action that the college can take. So if the CNO believes that a complaint cannot be dealt with through alternative dispute resolution or some other means, or they believe that a report from an employer, member of the public, or the nurse themselves requires further investigation, they will initiate an investigation process. So with a complaint, typically either a complaint investigation is initiated or something called a Section 75 investigation will be initiated, which is a more general and broad scope investigation. And typically within a report from an employer or former employer, a Section 75 investigation would be the type of investigation initiated. And so in this investigation process, the CNO will collect documents relevant to the subject matter of the investigation. And that might include interviews with the parties, with the complainant, with the former employer or representative of the former employer, or with other members of the public to get further information regarding the concerns raised. They will request information from the complainant potentially, or from the other party. And they will also provide the member an opportunity to provide a written response to all the materials collected in the investigation. So that's a really important opportunity for the member to advocate for themselves in that process, provide their perspective on the concerns and information regarding the report or the complaint. Once all this information is delivered to a panel of the Inquiries, Complaints and Reports Committee, also known as the ICRC, then the ICRC will deliberate and determine what steps need to be taken as a result of the investigation materials reached. So Zoe, we can switch. So once the ICRC has reviewed the materials from the complaint investigation or the Section 75 investigation, the ICRC has a number of possible dispositions that they may reach. The ICRC will consider whether there's sufficient evidence to warrant a potential finding of professional misconduct, and they will also consider the seriousness of the alleged conduct. They will consider any past decisions that the CNO has reached with respect to the member as well. So if there's been a past investigation or a past complaint raised, they'll look at those things too. If the evidence gathered doesn't support the complaint or report, then the ICRC may decide to take no further action. They may also provide some written advice to the nurse through their decision reached. And if the ICRC decides some remedial action is necessary, they may order the member to complete a remediation program. We call it a SCRP, or Specified Continuing Education and Remediation Program. Or they may require the member to attend for an oral caution before a panel of the ICRC. And then if the matter is sufficiently serious in the view of the ICRC panel, they may refer it to the discipline committee where there's concerns regarding professional misconduct. This process at the discipline committee looks similar to a more formal legal proceeding and can result in more serious outcomes such as restrictions to a nurse's practice, a suspension, or revocation. And briefly, the CNO could also conduct investigations and make referrals of members to the Fitness to Practice Committee where there are concerns about a member's health or capacity raised. I won't get into this process too much today. It's not really going to be the focus of our presentation today, but I would suggest, and our advice would be, that if you receive information regarding an inquiry into your capacity, that you should seek some advice about this process as early as possible. So quickly, because we're moving along here, there are a few things that you as members or future members of the CNO should keep in mind when responding to allegations concerning your practice. So first, a member has a duty to cooperate with investigations at the CNO, and this includes disclosing information requested and providing a response to the investigation where requested. A failure to cooperate with an investigation is actually identified as an act of professional misconduct under the Nursing Act, so it's important to take this obligation really seriously. Second, members are also expected to be accountable for their actions as a nurse, and this is something that the CNO will be looking for when it comes to responding to allegations concerning their conduct. Generally speaking, you are going to be expected to take ownership of the decisions that you make in your practice. Third, how the ICRC will decide in a matter does depend on the context and the explanation provided by the member. And one tip I like to give my clients is when you are making a decision in your practice, it's important to consider how you might explain this later on if you were questioned on it. And finally, members are expected to behave professionally when it comes to their practice as nurses and to investigations. And this is something that will also be considered by the ICRC. So overall, these processes can be quite overwhelming and challenging for nurses to deal with, and every case is very different. So our advice today is really general. But if you are facing a matter of your own, it would be advisable to seek out some assistance from a lawyer or from someone who is experienced with these types of matters at an early stage in the process so that you can protect yourself and your license.
Okay, great. Thank you, Nicole. So now we're going to jump into some case scenarios where we see workplace challenges, ethical decisions coming up in day-to-day practice. Now, the case scenarios we provided to you are fictional, okay? So we've created them, but we created them based on the types of conduct we see or certain patterns that come up in the scope of our practice or more common types of complaints or investigations we see. So we're going to go through 3 examples and talk about how that professional in the example could have done things differently. And we're also going to identify, what were the issues specifically raised. So our first case scenario here is time management really is at the crux of all of Lisa's problems in this scenario. And time management is something that we see as sort of the root cause of some of the complaints that arise, especially when you can see the snowballing effect of some smaller mistakes leading to larger mistakes or cutting corners that lead to complaints investigations later on. So I'm going to go over the scenario with you, and then we're going to talk about, what issues we can identify. So Lisa is an RPN who works in a large nursing home. She oversees the floor of the home with 60 beds alongside an RN and 2 PSWs. Over the last few weeks, Lisa started to make errors that she would not typically make, including she is becoming increasingly late in medication rounds, sometimes providing them over 1 hour late. On a number of occasions, she has forgotten to take the blood pressure of a patient as required before administering his medication. She has grown increasingly frustrated with certain residents, in one instance raising her voice. Toward the end of an evening shift on Tuesday, a resident fell in the bathroom. Lisa did not witness the fall, though the resident had some light bruising on her head. Lisa put the resident to bed and provided her aspirin. Lisa ran out of time to finish documenting the fall at the end of the shift, so she verbally told the incoming night shift RPN that a resident on floor 2 fell and should be monitored. On Wednesday morning, the morning shift RPN finds the resident unresponsive and she is rushed to the hospital. During her next shift on Wednesday evening, Lisa learns of these events. She goes into the patient's chart and writes a progress note based on her recollection from her shift the date prior. She writes the date of the note as Tuesday. Management terminates Lisa and reports the incident to the CNO, and a Section 75 investigation is opened into Lisa's practice. So, we're going ahead there. All right, so what issues does Lisa's conduct raise? And then what could Lisa have done differently? So there's a number of obvious issues on this face, as well as some interplay between these issues. So patient safety obviously is a concern here, not only with respect to the fall, but also the medication administration. We see record keeping issues, quality of care. Again, she starts cutting corners, she's overwhelmed, she's not able to do all of the tasks required of her during her shift. And then we see, of course, dishonesty and a fraudulent representation in a medical record as well. So I'm just going to flip back here to the case scenario so we can go through it together. Again, keeping those themes in mind of those issues. So of course, medication rounds. Medication rounds are obviously very important, that they're timely and accurate, making sure you're providing the right medication and it's done so in a timely manner. And the issue here is not only the fact that Lisa is providing the medication late, in this case, an hour late, which could significantly affect a patient depending on the medication, but it will also be an issue for other medication rounds to come. If the dosing is off, it could have an adverse effect on a patient. Again, we see this as a snowballing incident. On a number of occasions, of course, we have this patient, she needs to take his blood pressure. A failure to do so while could seem like something small could have an adverse, he could have an adverse reaction. There could be something wrong with his blood pressure. Maybe he shouldn't be administered the medication. And so while it seems like something small, it could have, again, a really adverse reaction on patient safety. Now here we run into, the next point, the frustration with residents. And, obviously, when you have a large portion of patients that you're in charge of or that you're overseeing, it can be very overwhelming. It can become stressful, but it's really important, obviously, to maintain professionalism at all times. Of course, some residents, especially in a long-term care nursing home setting, may suffer from dementia or may be very high needs. And it's important to maintain professionalism with them. He or she's yelled at a patient, that could be considered, abusing a patient, depending on the context of what was said, what happened. It could be really distressing. So again, that's, another instance here where Lisa's falling below the standards of the profession. And then, of course, we come to the fall incident. So falls, obviously are a frequent occurrence in a nursing home or long-term care setting. And they're one of those incidents among some of the others we've listed here where it may seem like, not a big deal when it happens, but a more significant or serious injury may take some time to show up. And so it's really important assessments are complete, but also that assessments are maintained or monitoring periods are met. And this is important, especially in terms of if it is shift work, if it needs to be communicated to the next staff on duty. And of course, communication is both a written communication, so making sure you're completing like falls report or your progress notes on time, but also with respect to verbal communication, right? So in this case, we have Lisa, she just says, oh, a resident fell on floor 2, should be monitored. But obviously, if she'd taken a couple more minutes and explained more fully that there could be a serious risk here, identify the patient, explain what had happened, she could have avoided this incident. And then finally, we come to, where Lisa makes already a difficult situation worse, essentially. And so we see that she makes a fraudulent representation. So she writes a note realizing, oops, I forgot to write the progress note. I probably should have. I'm stressed out by the situation. It could be an investigation. The client or patient, in this case, is in the hospital. Let me just write a note, as I would have at the time, from what I observed. And while her intentions may be to be accurate in the recording, putting the date prior is misconduct, okay? And that's a really serious thing. We always tell our clients never change a record, especially a medical record, because other people are also relying on that, and it could be seen as obstructing an investigation. So, if there is a record to be written, it makes sure it has the correct date. If it's addendum later on, or a further note, that's fine, but make sure that accurate reporting is happening, because in this case, that's an additional piece of misconduct now that Lisa's going to be facing. So what are some things that Lisa could have done to prevent an investigation, which is now quite serious? She could have raised workload and time management concerns with management. So a supervisor, a charge nurse, whoever, is in management role with respect to her, and, say that she feels as if, she doesn't want to compromise patient safety, need to, rework the workload. Even taking an additional 20 to 30 minutes to complete her documentation, especially in this case at the end of her shift, to make sure that it's clear for whoever is providing this person care next. Having ensured to properly communicate urgent matters to staff and changeover. Sought assistance from colleagues if she felt like she had to take care of one thing, maybe have someone help out with something else. And then, of course, consult workplace resources. And when we say resources, we don't just mean policies or advisories, but also like the resources that are available to you in the forms of mentors or management, or, a colleague who maybe has some specialized knowledge or some advice that could be helpful, again, in dealing with an incident while it arises, rather than letting it snowball and become a larger issue. And, obviously being not only a headache for the nursing professional down the road, but also for compromising patient safety. Okay, so Nicole, I'm going to turn it to you now to talk about our second case scenario.
Thanks, Zoe. So the second case scenario is based on the theme of honesty and disclosure. And again, this is something that we see come up time and time again with respect to matters that we're dealing with. So we've created this fake case scenario that deals with one aspect of this theme. Okay, so we're going to talk about Ben today. So Ben is an RN who's been working at a hospital setting for 2 years. Ben's been reviewing a job posting for a managerial role and believes, despite being a relatively new nurse, he has the skills the job is looking for. To increase his chances of being successful in the application process, Ben adds some additional responsibilities, which he does not have, to his description of his current role onto his resume. Ben also asks a family friend that he knows pretty well to pose as a former boss from a student job for a reference, because he cannot contact anyone he worked with at the organization. Ultimately, Ben is successful in securing the new position as a result of these additions to his resume and his reference. Over time, Ben continues to add some false descriptions of past employment on his resume and continues to use his friend as a stand-in for a reference. Ben can no longer remember what is accurate and what is not on the resume. However, Ben's not worried because he feels that the embellishments that he's added are accurate to the skills he actually possesses. In a recent application to a new position, Ben's prospective employer checks in with a past employer and discovers many discrepancies between Ben's reported job description and the employer's description. The prospective employer becomes concerned and reaches out to other past employers and discovers further inaccurate information. The prospective employer then declines to hire Ben and reports this information to the CNO, who initiate a Section 75 investigation. So, what issues does Ben's conduct raise? And what could Ben have done to prevent a report to the college in this case? So we're going to talk about issues related to professionalism, honesty, fraud, misrepresentation, and then of course, patient safety. So one of the issues, professionalism, Ben's conduct, raising these issues of dishonesty, typically being dishonest or disingenuous, will seem as unprofessional as it relates to one's professional practice as a nurse. Ben's failure to be honest about his actual qualifications or his experience gained as a nurse in the past, or using a false reference, will be seen as unprofessional conduct and may be qualifying as professional misconduct. With respect to honesty, while Ben may have seen his embellishments as being accurate to the skills that he possesses, it ultimately was not honest in terms of identifying how he obtained those skills, and was misleading to potential employers relying on disclosure about when making decisions about filling roles. And this might be viewed as a breach of trust. With respect to fraud, Ben's conduct issues raise issues about lying about his past professional experience, and this can be viewed as deception for the purpose of professional and personal gain. Ben misrepresented his professional background as well as the identity of his reference, and so this follows along with this issue of dishonesty and fraud. And then finally, with respect to patient safety, by overstating Ben's qualifications and providing false descriptions in terms of the roles that he had held in the past, Ben may end up in a more senior role, or a role that is beyond his scope of competency and his scope of practice. And the CNO would view this as potential risk to the public, as would a potential employer. So what could Ben have done differently here to protect himself, both with respect to potential employers and as well with the college? Well, the first thing is, it's a good practice to always maintain an up-to-date copy of a resume over time so that representations to prospective employers are accurate. Our memories fade over time, and a recollection of the jobs that we held in the past can also fade and change. So you can avoid the temptation to embellish by protecting yourself and taking on roles that suit your experience and your competency. And so this is kind of what Ben could have done here, is keep an updated resume over time, ensure that it's accurate, and then you don't have to question whether or not something actually happened later on in your practice. Second thing Ben could have done here is participate in continuing education courses and other programming to prepare for new opportunities. This is more substantial training than simply qualifying your skills in a way that you believe is true by adding in false descriptions on your resume, and will also help you develop your knowledge as you prepare for practicing in a new setting and role, and ensure that you are competent to fulfill the roles that you are applying for. Third, Ben could have spoken to trusted mentors when making changes on his resume to review these. And it's a good practice to have someone that you can go to with a copy of your resume and have them take a look at it as a second set of eyes to make sure everything looks okay and looks accurate. And this can help you catch things that you might miss on your own review. And finally, it's always a good practice for a number of reasons to try to keep in touch with trusted mentors, past supervisors, or managers from employment or placement experiences that you've had previously in order to reach out to them for references later on in the future. Doing so can also help you develop your network as a professional and will help you out in the long run with respect to seeking advice or promoting yourself for a future opportunity.
Okay, so now we're going to turn to our third case scenario. So we're going to talk about patient-nurse relationships. And again, this is another theme or common element we see in some complaints investigations that Nicole and I deal with in the course of our own practice. So Tyler works in a long-term care unit at a hospital. His unit consists mainly of elderly patients who have moderate to severe dementia and require ongoing assistance. One of the patients on the unit, Mr. Mills, was Tyler's neighbor prior to his admission. Tyler is acquainted with Mr. Mills prior to treating him at the hospital. During Mr. Mills' time on the unit, he and Tyler develop a friendship. Tyler will occasionally run errands for Mr. Mills and pick him up snacks or gum. On his birthday, Mr. Mills buys a card for Tyler and calls him his guardian angel. Mr. Mills tells Tyler that he is planning to appoint Tyler as an executor of his estate when he passes away. Mr. Mills loans Tyler $2,000 to help him repair his car. Tyler does not relay any of these interactions to management. Mr. Mills passes away a year after his admission to the unit. Tyler is notified that he has been appointed as the executor of Mr. Mills' estate. Mr. Mills' son becomes aware of the appointment and writes a complaint to the college. So let's talk about Tyler. What issues arise here? What went wrong? And what could he have done to prevent the complaint? So this is clearly a case of a conflict of interest. And, this is a case where Tyler could have maintained better boundaries and proper boundaries with the patient. And boundaries and conflicts of interest are things that we see arising in investigations and complaints brought by the college or by members of the public. The college standard sets out that members of the college should not be accepting gifts from patients. Okay, so we see here with Tyler that it's a bit of a slippery slope. It starts off with, smaller things like snacks or gum. But again, that's like special treatment to a specific patient. And then we see a much larger gift or the loan of $2,000 where we're falling into an actual financial arrangement. Now, financial entanglements, arrangements, or dealings with patients is not appropriate and will be considered a conflict of interest and would be grounds for some more serious findings of misconduct, including a referral to discipline. So it's really important for nurses to make sure that they're maintaining those professional boundaries with patients and identifying if they do believe a conflict of interest is arising and dealing with it appropriately. So what could Tyler have done to prevent this complaint against him? So first of all, he should have disclosed the pre-existing relationship to management, especially if he did think it could potentially be an issue. He should have declined the loan from Mr. Mills. Again, in doing so, he could explain that, he has professional obligations. He's not allowed to accept gifts from patients. Of course, it's always important to, be clear with patients and set up those boundaries from the beginning. He should have also, of course, decline financial arrangement with Mr. Mills, acceptance of loans, or even the knowledge that he was going to be the executor of this estate could be considered a financial arrangement, because he's making, he's in control essentially of his financial dealings, his personal estate. And in this case, Mr. Mills did advise him in advance that he planned to appoint him as appoint him as executor. So really, Tyler had forewarning about that, and should have raised that at that time, that was not an appropriate, setup between them. It's really important for nursing professionals to avoid conflicts in their practice. And should a conflict of interest arise, they should advise management and seek guidance on how best to handle the conflict of interest or a potential conflict moving forward. In more serious cases, it could be a patient reassignment. Remember, and again, this is not specific to this case scenario, but something that we do see arise. It is considered serious professional misconduct to engage in sexual relationship with a patient. There is legislation in Ontario that applies to all health professionals. So not just nurses, we're talking doctors, chiropodists, you name it. All health professionals, it's really important that there's no sexual abuse of patients. This legislation is in place to protect patients who are often vulnerable and are seeking assistance from professionals who are in a position of authority over them. So, this will result in mandatory revocation of a license. It's what the college will seek if they do believe that there has been a sexual relationship with a patient. So just something to keep in mind, that's a really clear boundary, based in law. So we're going to talk a little bit now about strategies and takeaways now that we've kind of reviewed these cases and some of the themes that come up.
So we've got a number of strategies and takeaways that we've listed here, and I'm going to go through them one by one. The first one that we want to make clear is it's really important to maintain good communication with colleagues in management, and especially asking for help when you need it. Nurses right now are facing higher workloads than ever before and busier practices. So this is a really important thing to keep in mind as you're going through your day-to-day. As a nurse, you are going to be held accountable for setting limits for yourself, working within your scope, and providing safe care to your patients. And that becomes more challenging when a workload increases. So to protect yourself, it's important to raise these issues to superiors and management so that you have put them on notice that there's an issue. So they're aware that you're struggling and, to let them know that you need help. Additionally, it can be really valuable to try to develop a good relationship with your colleagues, because this can also help with workplace and workload issues. The second takeaway is make sure you're taking time to complete records in an accurate and timely manner. Your documentation can not only protect patients and ensure that they have a clear and accurate record of their healthcare, but it also can provide protection to you as a nurse should a matter ever go before the College of Nurses. That documentation will be your record and your evidence of the actions that you took and the interventions that took place in the course of you providing care to a patient. And so maintaining those records carefully and taking the time you need to do a good job of that is really a good step for you to protect yourself as well as your patients. The third takeaway is to make sure you're being honest and accurate in self-representation to the college, to your peers, and to potential or current employers. It's easy to assume that an employer or a potential employer is not going to find out if you've included something that's not totally the truth or entirely honest on your resume, but just assume that they will, and that they're going to do the work that they need to make sure that you're a good candidate for the position. You're better off to build your skills and develop your practice by gaining experience and looking into opportunities for continuing education. And maintaining good relationships with past management and mentors is a great way to have good references on hand that can help you not only with the application process, but also in the process of listing references and providing people for potential employers to speak to about your practice. Fourth, it's important to maintain appropriate boundaries with patients at all times. And to do so, you'll need to constantly be assessing the relationship that you are building with patients to ensure that they are appropriate. And if you're perceiving a potential conflict of interest in your practice or an issue with a patient, speaking to a manager or superior and potentially making an appropriate referral to another healthcare professional may be necessary. Fifth, knowledge is power. Okay, and what we mean by that is staying up to date on your obligations with the college and the standards and the guidelines, and refreshing yourself as necessary on these processes that we've discussed today can help you prepare for a potential issue in the future in your practice. Attending this presentation today has hopefully given you some information about steps you can take to protect yourself, and also a little bit more knowledge about college processes. But it's also important for you to continue to review and do your own research on the standards and obligations that you have as a nurse. And the more you know, the more you can protect yourself in the future. And finally, it's important to seek advice from trusted peers, mentors, or consulting a lawyer when you feel you're facing a challenging situation and you don't know what to do. If you're facing a situation where you're unsure, seeking a second opinion or legal advice can help you with the decision-making process and can protect you should something arise later on in your practice. Okay. Zoe, I'll let you offer anything further if you'd like to.
One further note on takeaways, and Nicole is touching on resources available and keeping up to date. A really great resource is the college website. The CNO has very extensive practice standards. They have modules, learning modules, as well as guidelines that are really clear and about very specific topics. So there's one on medication, there's one on therapeutic nurse-client relationships, there's one on record keeping documentation, and it's something we often send our own clients to in terms of reviewing and showing remedial steps. But it's something that I think you can definitely refer to as a resource and keep to make sure you're up to date and meeting these standards. So I think now it's time for our Q&A. So I'll turn it to Shauna, who's going to moderate for us.
Yeah, and we already have one question in the chat box. How do you handle intense requests from friends who ask for your nursing opinion? One tends not to chart those discussions.
That's a great question. And it's something, that comes up also with lawyers. We all the time get asked by friends, family, cocktail parties for advice. And I can relate to that sentiment of, if someone is seeking advice from you, it's obviously important to always protect yourself and be very careful when providing advice outside the scope of your practice. Be clear that they should see, their physician if it's something pretty serious, and make sure that you aren't going beyond, what your scope of practice. I think, again, it's always good that they see a physician. You can always give your 2 cents, but at the end of the day, make sure you're protecting yourself, because that person could make a complaint. I mean, one thing to keep in mind always is that a complaint can be made by anyone from the public. So say, someone doesn't appreciate the advice, or it's against, something is worsened by it, they could make a complaint, and it could be seen to have established a nurse-patient relationship. So just be very careful in terms of providing advice outside the scope of your normal practice.
Thank you. I don't see any other questions right now, unless someone wants, someone's raised their hand.
Hi, thank you very much for your presentation. It was very interesting and engaging, so I appreciated that. I don't know if it's a question or a comment, but I did my PhD at University of Toronto, and I looked at the nursing work environment and how it led to medication errors in the work environment. And basically, anecdotally, a lot of nurses said, well, I can never get my medications given within the hour time frame because my workload's too heavy. And I think of that pre-COVID. And I think about my supervisor at University of Toronto, and her work always showed that nursing should be staffed to like 72% of the workload that they should cover. That allows for fluctuations, patients getting sick, patients coming to units. And we knew that back then people were staffed at like 100%, like we were just working flat out all the time. And now COVID hit, and I think it just even sheds a light. And I think about your first case scenario as being more of casualty of, and I mean, she shouldn't have lied. I get all those pieces, right? I appreciate that. But being more a casualty of the system that is staffing people way beyond what they can cope with to do a good, high quality job. And I don't know if you have any advice how people navigate that, or does it need to be a bunch of nurses saying, we're done, like we're not handling this workload anymore, it's not safe? Like, how do we as a group of professionals protect the public, but also protect each other to make sure we don't end up in one-offs kind of falling through the cracks because they can't cope with a workload that really is not realistic?
Right. No, and you know, that's such a great point. And I really, what we're trying to convey with that example, it's something we see often is professionals who have just very high workloads, you know, are in charge of a very large amount of patients. You know, they have so much to do within one shift. And, you know, again, I think it is an issue larger than even this discussion about, you know, staffing and policies, you know, and different care settings, right? You know, I think it's really important for nurses to rely on each other. And I think it's important to raise issues about workload to management as soon as they come up, to try and see if there's something that can be done about, you know, even having a colleague help you out, or if there's a way that the team can be structured maybe to kind of, you know, check each other's work, or, you know, be accountable. I know a lot of settings, you know, your colleagues are really everything, right? That you really rely on each other as you conduct your shift. And, you know, it really is unfortunate. I think especially now, even with the amount of, you know, in the news, like the amount of nurses are just spread so thin with the pandemic. And, you know, things can snowball. So I think it's just really important to keep in mind, you know, raising issues when they happen with workload, just so that, you know, management is aware of them. And, you know, in many cases, I'm sure they are, but also making sure you're protecting yourself. So if you need to stay a little later and do those records, do it, because you want to protect yourself. You want to cover, you know, your own, you know, cover yourself. And as a lawyer, we use that phrase, but cover yourself in terms of any liability you could have, right? And maybe it means a little bit of extra work sometimes, but it would be worthwhile down the end, because like, you know, and Nicole mentioned in her piece in terms of takeaways, the records are not only to ensure patient safety, but they're to protect you, to show, okay, you know, I did X, Y, Z to make sure that this person was safe. And if something happens, you can rely on that at a later point. I don't know, Nicole, do you want to add to that at all?
Yeah, no, I think those are all really good points. And one thing I would add too, that I think relates also to one of the questions I'm seeing in the chat. Ultimately, you have to be, you have to look out for yourself, and you have to be accountable for your practice. And unfortunately, yeah, our current environment, as we've seen on the news and as we see in our practice, it's very challenging for nurses. And sometimes it's a matter of assessing your current role and just deciding whether or not that's a good fit for you. And if that's something that's going to potentially pose a risk to you maintaining your license to practice. And sometimes it comes down to you making those decisions for yourself and deciding that another environment might be better suited for you, just to ensure that you can look out for yourself and make sure that you're protected. And so that's the only point that I would add. I think that covers it.
Thank you.
Great. A couple more questions have entered the chat box. Nicole, I'm not sure which one you might have answered. You might have answered Ginger's question, but I'll just start with Lisa. So, advice for when nursing expresses an unsafe situation, goes to resources, is honest about burnout, is refused vacation due to COVID, and is told that she needs to keep going even in an unsafe situation with regards to medications and treatments.
Yeah, I think so, Lisa. I think I was sort of touching on your question there too. And I think it relates a lot to what Zoe just discussed as well. But essentially, you know, if you've taken all the steps that you can in your practice to raise awareness of the issues that you're facing and raise issues that you're facing with respect to your ability to provide safe and effective patient care, ultimately, you know, you need to look out for yourself and your own license to practice. And it might be a matter of, fortunately, needing to make a switch in terms of the environment that you're in. But no, it's, you know, there's no real easy answer to that question. It's is a huge problem for many nurses. But ultimately, when it comes to protecting yourself with respect to the college, you need to look out for yourself. And if you're not in a situation where you can provide safe nursing care, then you need to look at your options for changing your circumstances, which can be very challenging. I admit that.
And, it goes to say that, at the end of the day, it's your license and your ability to practice. And you don't want to jeopardize that. And no one else should be jeopardizing that as well, including, if you're being put in situations that are unsafe, or you think you're not able to meet the standards, again, that's a very difficult position to be into, and not one that you may decide to leave for those reasons. Again, it's hard to say without being too specific, right, about a situation, but you really need to protect your license, because if something serious does happen and you haven't met the standards of the profession, it could result in discipline. And in terms of discipline, we're talking about suspensions of license, and in more serious cases, revocation of a license. So, you do need to protect yourself in that sense, and you have to advocate as a professional about, if you feel that the standards aren't being met, you have a responsibility to take action or get out of that situation from the college's perspective too, right? Because you personally as a nurse have obligations. But we understand it. We see some really incredibly challenging situations, and it is unfortunate, especially in this climate, right? It's a lot of people are burnt out, in particular, obviously the healthcare sector. They're being asked to do things that maybe weren't before, and there's more demand than ever. So, it is a challenging situation for sure.
I just want to say that it's more than a challenging situation, and it's more than accountability, because it is pervasive. It is, we are on the brink of not being able to provide patient care, and the unions aren't strong. People are not feeling protected. So it's much more than the theory around accountability to the standards of the college. Like, we are in a crisis situation. We cannot provide basic care anymore. And I'm wondering if the theoretical frameworks are still relevant during COVID, because I believe that if many nurses could find other jobs, they would. I mean, people are leaving the professions, people are retiring earlier than they ever have. So I was hoping that in this presentation, we would talk more about the decision-making to support nurses during this time. And maybe that could be a follow-up conversation, because it's pervasive wherever we are, whether we're in a large teaching hospital or in a COVID unit in a long-term care setting.
Absolutely. And I think, Lisa, it's such a great point. I think, really we're in such a time of crisis, really, is you framed it perfectly there. It is really difficult. And this profession is being faced with, hard, decisions that they haven't before. I think, a lot of these, the pervasive nature of this is sort of beyond the scope even of today's discussion. But I think, really, it's important for nurses to try their best. I mean, obviously, it's a difficult position to try and protect yourself, but we get that it's an unprecedented situation, essentially, right?
And I think that nurses need unprecedented support. And it's only now that the college is looking at being more flexible in terms of what the needs are. This is a crisis that I think we really need to address in terms of real time, because we are going to be losing a lot of nurses. And I feel for the nurses that are in nursing school and the nursing students, like, oh boy, they're not even getting the clinical experience. And then they're going to be practicing. So I really feel that we need to step up to the plate and really look at how we used to think about nursing at the bedside, think about accountability, decision-making, ethics, because I think that the profession is going to lose a lot, and we're going to be full of unregulated professions caring for really sick patients. Thank you.
Thanks, Lisa. There were a couple more notes and questions in the chat box, but I'm not sure we'll have time to get to them today. I just wanted to say thank you again so much, Nicole and Zoe, for this great presentation and initial discussion. Clearly, this is a really important topic, especially now more than ever. And thanks for everyone for attending. As you know, we host several Lunch and Learns throughout the year. We're hosting our next session on March 17th, featuring PhD student Sarah Ling talking about her doctoral research focusing on mental health and withdrawal management services. So stay tuned for an invite for that. And once again, thanks to Laerdal Medical Canada for allowing us to have these great sessions. And thanks to my colleague, Carolyn Peralta, who helped organize today's event, and enjoy the rest of your day.